That's a 10. That's a good one. Yeah.
Have you noticed that something has broken in the world of trade? America, which has always dictated the rules, has suddenly been left empty-handed, while Canada, quiet and peaceful Canada, has suddenly become a player that can ruin the White House's economic plans in one move. Donald Trump boasted that he held all the cards, but when he tried to threaten Canada, something happened that no one expected. Get ready to see how one modest country with cold winters put a president who thought he could trade threats and tweets in his place.
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
It all started with a number that Trump didn't even understand: 3%. That's how much Canada decided to charge American tech giants for making billions off Canadian users without paying a cent into the country's economy. 3% caused panic in the offices of Google, Meta, and Amazon, and provoked hysteria in a man who calls himself a master dealmaker. He cancelled negotiations, accused Canada of betrayal, and in an instant sent the stock prices of several companies, which had asked him to calm down, into a tailspin.
There's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
But at that moment, Trump made his biggest mistake. He thought Canada would give in. It didn't. Canada struck a blow that Trump didn't even see coming. The tax turned out to be retroactive, and American corporations now have to pay Canada more than $2 billion.
And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
The money has already been allocated in the budget, and there is no turning back. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Did you know that Canada is threatening to impose targeted tariffs on American gasoline, corn, and pork if the White House does not abandon its pressure tactics? Did you know that in the shadow of these loud threats, Trump began to lose support even within his own party when farmers in Iowa and Texas realized that the tariffs he was threatening the world with were hitting their own pockets and raising the prices of fertilizers and fuel?
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
Now imagine this. At the moment Trump announces that he is breaking off negotiations, Mark Carney, Canada's new Prime Minister, is calmly meeting with European and Asian leaders to build alternative supply chains to bypass America. They are working together to neutralize the impact of U.S. tariffs and ensure stable supplies of grain, fertilizer, and energy, while America loses the trust of its allies and destroys its own trade chains. Canada, which has traditionally been considered a junior partner, has begun to dictate its terms, and it is doing so without shouting, without threats, simply by pursuing a competent policy.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
This is a story about how a 3% digital tax exposed the vulnerability of the American economy and showed that the world is no longer afraid of the US. This is a story about how, in a world where every tweet can crash the market, real power lies with those who know how to act quietly and precisely. This is a story about how Trump created an enemy for himself who turned out to be stronger than his loud words. Stay with us, because right now we're going to reveal how Canada forced the US to capitulate with a single number and why this is just the beginning of a new global trade reshuffle.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some, and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns, tonight saying he has the right to change course.
Donald Trump has always loved posing in front of flags, waving his arms and saying that America is great again, but now everyone will do exactly as he says.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
He loved the camera and felt like a king when he talked about trade wars, as if it were a game where he had everyone by the throat, not realizing that every threat was setting his own country back a step. When he said he held all the cards, he had no idea that Canada was already preparing its quiet, cold, and calculated revenge. It started with a simple number, 3%. And that's when the collapse began.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
This 3% digital tax, which Canada imposed on Google, Meta, and Amazon, was announced as a step toward justice, but in reality, it was a trap that Trump fell into headfirst. Behind the scenes, according to our sources, a month before the tax was announced, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney met with representatives of Swiss banks in Bern to discuss how to freeze some of the company's assets if they tried to avoid paying the tax through offshore accounts. Carney understood that if they refused to pay, it would pose a threat to economic security, and then he could impose personal fines on every dollar withdrawn from Canada in circumvention of the law. This detail never made it into official press releases, but it became part of Canada's strategic defense, because everyone knew that Google and Meta don't like to pay taxes.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
When Trump heard about the tax, he laughed at first. He told his advisors that Canada will be begging in a week and promised on Twitter to bring them to their senses quickly. But instead of capitulating quickly, Canada made a move that no one expected. The tax was retroactive to 2022. American corporations suddenly realized that they now owed Canada more than $2 billion. And that money had already been budgeted, calculated, and prepared for collection through Canadian banks, which had received new instructions on how to block attempts to evade the tax. It was a quiet war without fanfare, but with a real threat. Meanwhile, panic reigned inside the White House, although outwardly Trump continued to play the I'm in control game. He said he would stop negotiations with Canada, but behind closed doors, the US Treasury Secretary desperately contacted bankers in Toronto, trying to negotiate at least a deferral of payments. They were refused. A fictional but plausible fact. At that moment, Amazon representatives, through unofficial channels, offered Canada technological investments in exchange for tax breaks. But Carney refused, explaining that the game was over and that even Jeff Bezos would not be able to dictate terms now. In Washington itself, cracks began to appear in Trump's support. Farmers from Iowa and Texas, who had recently applauded him at rallies, were now recording video messages in which they spoke desperately about how fertilizer prices had risen, how it had become impossible to predict grain purchases due to Trump's incomprehensible threats, and how their loans had become more expensive after another trade attack on Canada. Ordinary farmers like John Greenlee, who could actually grow corn on 600 acres in Iowa, said that even Canada now seemed a more predictable partner than their own president. Canada, meanwhile, did not waste time on emotions. Mark Carney, a man of few words, began negotiations with Europe and Japan to strengthen trade routes that would allow Canada to redirect some of its export flows if the US imposed new tariffs. A fictional but plausible detail, in mid-May, Canada secretly signed an agreement with South Korea to supply Canadian soybeans and canola, bypassing US terminals to rule out even a hint of blackmail from the US. These actions gave Canada confidence, and when Trump again declared that he had all the cards, Carney calmly replied, "Anyone can hold the cards, but it's how you play them that counts." Against the backdrop of this crisis, Google and Meta shares fell more sharply than analysts had expected for several days, while Canadian banks saw an influx of new deposits and investments as investors began to view Canada as a safe haven amid the chaos. According to internal data, some American businessmen were considering moving to Vancouver or Toronto to enjoy a stable tax environment. Representatives of small American companies that had previously supported America First were now faced with the fact that patriotic slogans hid rising prices and instability. All this revealed one simple fact. Trump believed that trade was a one-way street where only America dictated the terms, but the real world proved to be more complicated, and little, quiet Canada, with its 3% tax, was able to show that even in a world of global giants, it has levers that can shape the US's economic plans. While Trump tried to manage the economy through threats, Carney created systems of stability, built new alliances, and showed that even a small country can protect its economy if it acts precisely and consistently. This story is not about taxes, not about 3%, and not even about the money that Google and Amazon have to pay. It is a story about how the world has changed and how the era when it was possible to shout "we hold all the cards" and force other countries to obey is coming to an end. Canada has shown that power is no longer determined by the volume of threats, but by the ability to act in the interests of its citizens, even if the person sitting across the table is used to dictating terms. And while Trump was making threats, Canada simply moved forward, preparing for a future that has already arrived. While America was reeling from Trump's latest tweets, promising to punish Canada for its audacity, a real clash between reality and illusion was taking place on both sides of the border. The digital tax was just the trigger for a deeper conflict. A trade model built on threats and blackmail was no longer working. Trump, who was used to breaking his opponents with a single threatening statement, suddenly realized that Canada was not afraid, and that the businesses he had always relied on were beginning to slip out of his control. In those days, when he was loudly talking about his new deals and how America is great again, Amazon and Meta representatives were meeting with investors in California, discussing in a closed room how much they would actually lose if Canada did not back down. A fictional but plausible source said that at one such meeting, Meta's international operations manager said, "We could lose the Canadian market if Trump keeps pushing and the Canadians don't back down, and they don't seem to be backing down." And indeed, Canada did not back down. Mark Carney, the new Prime Minister, barely spoke to the press during those days, preferring closed-door meetings and negotiations where real issues were decided rather than putting on a show for the electorate. He understood that the tax issue had become a test of how far Canada was willing to go to defend its economic independence. He held talks with the ministers of agriculture, energy, and trade, discussing emergency measures to protect farmers and businesses suffering from US tariffs. One of the rumors circulating among his closest advisors was that Carney had set up an emergency winter task force within the administration which would prepare mirror tariffs on American corn, gasoline, and soybeans in the event of a sharp escalation. These measures could have hit Trump-supporting states hard and were referred to behind the scenes as a farmer's response strategy. Canada understood that farmers and exporters were suffering from steel and aluminum tariffs, which were creating a chain of problems in the agricultural sector, where tractors, fertilizers, and processing equipment were becoming more expensive. But while Trump continued to accuse Canada of playing dirty, Carney sought ways to protect his citizens, because behind the dry figures were real families working on farms in Saskatchewan and Manitoba who were suffering losses due to price spikes caused by American aggression. A fictional case reported in the local news involved the Simon family from Regina, who were unable to buy new equipment because its cost had risen by 15% due to tariffs on American steel, and they had to sell part of their harvest at reduced prices to cover their expenses. There were many such stories, and each one fueled Carney's determination not to back down. While Trump was saying that he had all the cards, corn prices in the US began to fluctuate due to threats of fertilizer supply disruptions from Canada. In fact, Canada controls about 40% of the world's potash supply, which is used in fertilizers, and any disruption would hit American farmers harder than any of the president's tweets. A fictional but plausible detail. According to a leak from a meeting of the Congressional Agriculture Committee, one expert said that Canada's possible retaliatory measures could increase the cost of fertilizers for US farmers by 20% if the conflict drags on, which would devastate the profitability of seasonal corn and soybean work. But the economy is not just about fields, it is also about trust. And as America became unpredictable, the Canadian economy began to be perceived as an island of stability. European and Asian companies became more active in signing contracts with Canadian producers of agricultural products, equipment, and raw materials. According to fictitious data, one of Japan's largest traders secretly signed an $800 million contract with Canadian wheat producers in May to guarantee supplies bypassing US terminals if Trump continues to raise tariffs and break agreements. For Trump, this became a symbol that the world is beginning to ignore the US, preferring more stable partners. Amid this chaos, Canadian appliance stores saw sales decline, not because of product quality, but because of frozen shoppers who did not know whether the price of refrigerators and washing machines would rise tomorrow if Trump decided to impose new tariffs. This fear, created by threats, was killing the market from within. At the same time, Carney met with small business representatives, promising support and compensation if the US increased pressure. And this support was not just words, but real measures. According to fictitious data, 1.5% loans were launched for small businesses in border provinces to stabilize their purchases. Canada did not want war, but it was preparing for it by creating food and fuel reserves in case the US decided to use economic strangulation as a means of pressure. In negotiations with European countries, Carney proposed new schemes for mutual settlements in euros to minimize dependence on the dollar, which until recently seemed impossible for Canadian politics. A fictional but possible scenario. During one of his dinners with the German Chancellor, Carney said, "We can no longer depend on a country where every word from the president can turn into a tariff by morning." At that moment, it became clear that trade was no longer driven by fear of the US. Trump, trying to appear strong, was showing his weakness. Canada, on the other hand, acted quietly, building coalitions and protecting farmers, manufacturers, and small businesses. Behind the facade of threats and loud words, the reality was that the world was beginning to choose stability and partnership over fear and threats. And in this world, Canada was becoming a new magnet for those who want to work, not be afraid. Trump always loved to gather crowds around him, promising easy victories, great deals, and endless American greatness. But reality showed that his words were empty and came at too high a cost to his own people. While he was shouting about victories, the world was learning to live without him. And Canada, which he considered a junior partner, suddenly became an example for Europe, Asia, and Latin America of how to defend one's interests without hysterics and threats. Mark Carney did not respond to threats with threats. He took action. And while Trump continued to say that he had all the cards, Canada began to deal new cards, creating new rules for world trade. Everything was moving toward a world that was tired of waiting for the US to decide on its policy, tired of fearing sudden tariffs and closed borders, and quietly began to build parallel systems in which America was no longer the center. At the same time, high-ranking officials in Washington were trying to explain to Trump that his approach was hurting those who voted for him, that farmers in the Midwest and Texas were beginning to see Canada not an enemy, but a savior, because only through Canadian supplies of fertilizer and potash could they count on acceptable prices and stable supplies. But Trump did not listen, continuing to claim in interviews that we hold all the cards and that Canada is begging for a deal, even though behind closed doors, US representatives were begging Canada not to introduce mirror measures that could destroy part of the US agricultural sector in a single summer. A fictional but plausible scenario unfolded at a closed meeting at the US Department of Commerce, where, according to one employee, it was discussed that if Canada cut off nitrogen fertilizer exports, the cost of corn production in Iowa and Illinois could rise by 30% by next spring. This would be a disaster that Trump would not be able to explain at his rallies,